Thanks everyone for coming out to our second event in the Fort Bend, Sugarland area. Sorry for blocking you, Dr. Zwald. My name is Tatiana. I am one of the program coordinators for the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. Essentially what that means is I get to work with our program director, Ronan, to put on these fantastic programs all throughout the Houston area, including a few of the suburbs. Some of the stuff that we've got going on coming up is we've actually got an event on November 9th at the Royal Sonesta with Congressman Adam Schiff. He's going to be in conversation with our very own Ronan O'Malley, and anyone that buys a ticket will also get his book as a gift for coming to that event. It'll be super interesting, and I definitely recommend you guys check it out. Balancing that out, on December 16th at the Four Seasons, we've actually got a luncheon with Dan Crenshaw, and he'll be talking a little bit about how the U.S. deals with foreign policy and how that affects domestic policy as well. And then hopefully later on in December, we'll also have another event back here with Dr. Eric Botts from the University of St. Thomas to talk a little bit about global security and how that plays into international politics and whatnot. But for tonight, it is my pleasure to actually introduce Dr. Zach Zwald. Dr. Zach Zwald is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Houston. He serves as the director of the UH Center for International and Comparative Studies and director of UH's degree minor in National Security Studies. Previously, Dr. Zwald was an assistant professor jointly appointed in the U.S. Air War College and the U.S. Air Force Center for Unconventional Weapons Study, where he held a top secret security clearance, something I don't think most people can get, which is a super high accomplishment in and of itself. In that capacity, he oversaw the nuclear and deterrence curriculum at the Air University and directed a year-long group research seminar of MA students on nuclear weapons policy, technology, and strategy. Dr. Zwald has published his research on nuclear deterrence, judgment and decision-making during military technology innovation, and human trust dynamics and artificial intelligence in the battlefield. From 2017 to 2019, Zwald was the principal investigator on a project funded by the U.S. Department of Defense to conduct a series of deterrence decision experiments on the U.S. Public and military officers, ranked major through general, attending a professional military education institute. He has presented his research to various U.S. government audiences, including U.S. Strategic Command, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, Lawrence Livermore Headquarters, Air Force/A-10, and the CIA. Zwald has served as a faculty fellow at MIT Security Studies Program and a postdoctoral fellow at the Ohio State University's Mershon Center for International Studies. He received his MA and PhD in political science from UC Berkeley, and today he'll be in conversation with our program director, Ronan O'Malley. I hope you guys enjoy.
Thank you, Tatiana. I was thinking actually reading the bios is one of the hardest things to do. There's a lot packed in there. And thank you very much, Zach, for joining us again. And Astros, we will be done around 8 o'clock, so we'll definitely see most of the game, and hopefully it's better than last night. But yeah, thank you again to the Fort Bend Chamber of Commerce for hosting us today. And this is a very important, a long-standing problem, an issue of concern, whether it's Democratic president, Republican president, whoever it might be, whatever Congress it is, and our allies. So thank you so much for, you're not briefing generals or colonels today, but for talking to lay people like ourselves to help a better understanding of what's going on here. Talk us through the overall basic issues of proliferation. It's 80 years or so since the United States developed and first used nuclear weapons, atomic weapons. Right. But what are the realities of proliferation in terms of what are the challenges in acquiring the knowledge to build a weapon, to actually get the fissile material and enrich it to make a bomb, right, and then to test it, and then
regardless of the technology now not being cutting edge and it being fairly well understood, it is not easy to execute for any state. And I think that's, all you need to do is compare what President Kennedy said in the early 60s about the likely numbers of nuclear weapon states by the 70s, 80s, and by the 21st century. And he thought that there would be 70 or 80 by this time of history. So the fact that there are 9, while in many cases seems, or at least demonstrates, despite our best attempts at failure, why it's very hard for these folks who want to get a bomb to get one. So if you're trying to get a nuclear weapon, you have to figure out how to get a hold of either a turnkey bomb, right, which is just sort of what we see in the movies, but isn't really a realistic option. And when you turn from that, then it's a matter of getting the fissile material, the stuff that will provide, you have to enrich it. So these things, the material is not found in nature at the isotope, at the character of the uranium and plutonium that's necessary for nuclear weapons. So then you have to get the material to make it into weapons-grade fuel. And that itself is hard to come by. You can buy it from different places, but there are a lot of institutional constraints, international law, checking and tracing the trade and if you get the enrichment equipment, well, then you have to find weapons designs, and very rudimentary ones are widely available, more sophisticated ones are harder to come by. But then what I think is perhaps the least appreciated bottleneck in acquiring nuclear weapons, right? And so in that component of making a nuclear weapon, I think about recipes or watching a cooking show. And you're watching this professional chef and they're throwing all the stuff together and they're simmering a little bit and they're talking to the camera and they're moving on to the next thing. And then maybe the home chef tries to make it at home and they do nuanced details of making a dish, when the oil or the water comes up to a certain degree, bubbles form on the top, and that's when you need to transfer it over here. But they didn't put that in the recipe, and they didn't talk about that on the show. So making a nuclear bomb is not unlike that, where a lot of it is the learning by doing. And so, luckily, that has been a prevent brain drain from Russia and China and other countries where that expertise is known. So I'd say that's an overview. Once we get past the bomb, then as Ronan alluded to, how do you get that bomb to a target, right? You could put it in a container ship and send it somewhere. And that will then have a nuclear blast and radiological effect in a port somewhere. If you want a more pinpointed strategic or tactical effect, then you need a plane to deliver it, or you need oftentimes missiles. And that's, again, hard to come by, right? So the story about nuclear proliferation, particularly as we'll talk about it tonight, has often boiled down to one about missiles. And in North Korea and Iran, we are perhaps more concerned with their evolution of developing highly accurate long-range missiles than we are the nuclear bomb itself, because that makes it a more usable and thus threatening capability.
And just related to that, people hear about the terminology a dirty bomb. It's not an actual nuclear detonation, but it's a conventional explosive that releases reactivity. Can you talk about the threat of a dirty bomb and why that's concerning as well, even if it's not the same level of destruction?
So this became a concern following the fall of the Soviet Union, right? It became this idea that if you have some small amount of radiological material, so I went through those steps of getting the fuel and then enriching the fuel and then finding the weapon design and finding the delivery system, and that's complex. So if you can just get some radioactive material, and maybe not even uranium or plutonium, sort of one of the nightmare scenarios is that smoke detectors contain trace amounts of radioactive cesium. And if you gather enough of them together and put it together with a conventional explosive, a stick of dynamite, fertilizer to expand the conventional detonation, that can distribute the radiation without a radiological effect of a nuclear weapon, but enough of a radiological effect to cause death and destruction in a significant area, but then the follow-on psychological effects and economic and political effects would likely be catastrophic.
And you talked about the challenges of delivery methods. How do you do it? People maybe heard about the idea of the triad. You mentioned delivery by, say, a strategic bomber,
right,
or a small weapon by a fighter, by long-range missiles, or it could be short-range if they're North Korea attacking South Korea. But can you also talk about the threats from submarines?
Yeah. So one of the points of evolution since 1945 is this notion of a nuclear triad, and partly through bureaucratic inertia, partly through the development of nuclear strategy, it became this widely held consensus in the US and the Soviet Union that if you have the redundancy of having air delivery, so a bomber and fighters, missiles, and then submarines, the redundancy of those three capabilities provide what's called an invulnerable second strike capability. Like, you will not be attacked if you have that triad, but most notably, if you have submarines, that is seen in and of itself to provide that robust deterrent. And the idea there is, if you have a nuclear-powered submarine, then it runs relatively silent, right? The best technology in the world, as of today, still can't detect them. As we heard with the latest announcement of the US allowing Australia to have nuclear-powered subs, this technology is still held by only a couple of countries. China is still working on having a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines that can launch ballistic missiles. But they pose the biggest threat because from the time they would surface, perhaps 100 miles off the coast of their target country, we would have 10 to 20 minutes before they hit their target. So they are, as of today, undefensible.
And just related to that, all three, as you kind of said, all three delivery systems have their downfalls, but also have their strengths. You know, delivery by strategic bomber. Most countries have pretty good air defenses. There's technologies. Can you talk about the technology? Missiles, long-range missiles. What's the reality there?
So the reality is, as you were talking about, bombers are looked at and as a nice delivery system because they're recallable, right? Unless you have a Dr. Strangelove scenario where one becomes not able to be recalled, but you can send them out, you can signal with them. If you're angry at an opponent, you can mobilize them, put them in the air, and that tells your opponent way at getting a weapon 30 minutes or less on a target, an ICBM as held by the US, the Soviet Union, and increasingly by China. Missile defense is something that people have sort of heard about in this country for decades. We pursued it in the 50s and the 60s. We signed a treaty to stop pursuing it in the 1970s. President Reagan famously said in 1983 that we will pursue a strategic defense fleet. Now, many decades since President Reagan's announcement, we have spent hundreds of billions of dollars on researching different means of intercepting missiles, and we have a few tens of missile interceptors located in Southern California at Vandenberg Air Force Base and then up in Alaska. In terms of the effectiveness, how much of a defense they provide, of effectiveness, so that if North Korea threw one missile at us that was relatively unsophisticated without countermeasures to spoof our defenses, if we threw 2 or 3 or 4 missiles, some theater missile defenses based in South Korea and Japan, and then those on the west coast of the US that I mentioned, we would probably be able to intercept 1 North Korean missile for every 3 or 4 interceptors we threw.
A Chinese missile, it's usually not just one warhead, correct? It's before getting on target, higher up in the atmosphere, it would break apart into multiple warheads, make it that much more difficult.
Right. Well, this is where arms control comes into play, because the U.S. and the Russians, under the New START Treaty in 2010, so Obama and Putin, they agreed to limit each missile to 1 warhead, and Russians and Americans each year but yeah, if a country like Russia or China has multiple weapons, what's called MIRVing the missile, then when it's left the atmosphere, when it's in space, multiple missiles will be released. At that point, also usually decoys would be released so that our missile defense system would see multiple cold objects in space moving at about the same speed, and we have to throw up, maybe 6, 7 of Chinese and Russian hypersonics. If that's what they're throwing at us, we don't have anything that can shoot it down. So hypersonic missile is something moving at 5+ times the speed of sound. And we can't, at this point, track it and coordinate with the interceptor to take it out of the sky.
And can you also explain why, on its surface, people might say, well, if we develop an anti-ballistic missile system, deterrence kind of is gone if they're concerned about the U.S. being able to launch a first strike and basically stopping their retaliation, and basically the balance of power is gone.
Right. So as I teach this at U of H, the weirdest evolution following the development of nuclear weapons is this idea of mutual vulnerability being necessary. Called the sword of Damocles that's hanging above our heads, or we both have guillotines and we're holding the other's rope. So this notion that since we can destroy the Soviets or the Russians and they can destroy us, then it becomes a matter of common security for neither of us to use our nuclear weapons. So the notion of a nuclear revolution, which is a common term in academia, it's this notion that for all time before game, if I increase my security, you decrease your security. But with nuclear weapons and this condition of mutual vulnerability, the notion is if we're both rational and are making rational decisions under crisis conditions, then my ability to erase your civilization and yours to do the same to mine means we are more secure and more unified in our security than ever before since mankind started throwing rocks and sticks at each other. And the problem is bought onto this idea. The Soviets thought we were crazy, and it was all a ruse to keep them vulnerable while we built something to best them. And maybe the Soviets caught on in the late 80s, and the Russians believed it in the 90s. But it seems, unfortunately, that Putin doesn't buy onto this notion, and that for his own strategic reasons, he has begun actively planning for fighting and winning a
Just turning to specifics, we'll talk to North Korea and then Iran and kind of broader concerns beyond them. Could you talk about the actual current capabilities of North Korea now with regards to its nuclear capabilities, and then also its delivery capabilities with regards to long-range missiles, obviously, or what are they trying to do with regards to submarines?
Right. So the North Koreans have conducted a handful of nuclear tests dispersed around North Korea. The first couple were roughly fizzles. They barely registered. They were maybe around a half a kiloton. The most recent hit 100 kilotons, and that tells the international community that they've mastered thermonuclear weapons. So they can now go into the hundreds kiloton range, which, just as a point of reference, we're talking tens of times. In terms of the size of their arsenal, from various experts that I've talked to, they sort of said if someone tells you they know how big the arsenal is, check your wallet because they're not to be trusted. So North Korea is a very closed society. Our human intelligence capabilities are very limited. A lot of the projections you see in the think tank community are based on the amount of fuel that we think they've made from their breeder reactors. So if they have X amount of fuel, they can make because North Korea, other than their nuclear weapons program, is an incredibly poor country. So the idea that they would devote maximum resources to converting all of their fuel to bombs seems unrealistic to me. But we know they have, assume they have a handful of multiple kiloton nuclear weapons. They have repeatedly tested short and medium range missiles, significant we know they've tested a couple times an ICBM range missile. So one, they don't shoot it that way, they shoot it straight up in the air, but then based on how far it goes up, we can say, oh, if that had a shallower trajectory, it would have reached its apogee, its height, and been able to fall and maybe hit somewhere in the northwestern continental. So big thing we don't know these days is whether or not they can miniaturize a nuclear weapon so that it fits on a missile. And the idea here is to have a nuclear device that will detonate in an underground chamber is very different than having a device that can fit on a nose cone of a missile. And to shrink the components and still have the same performance as you get from the test is quite a technological achievement. And we have no evidence yet that they have done that.